Hello, my darling ducklings. It's time once again for an episode of Language Learning for Pretty Birds. Today, I'm going to give you an overview of the four skills of language learning: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Because you've learned so much theory already, which means I'm intensely proud of you, this video will talk about how that theory applies a little differently for each of these four skills. I'll also tell you about how first language acquisition influences us as adults within that context. And with each skill, I'll include strategies to tackle them. So let's go. Starting with the four skills. We divide the four skills thus. We have the receptive, not passive, but receptive skills of listening and reading, and the productive skills of speaking and writing. But there is another division that doesn't get talked about as much as it ought to, which is this. Listening and speaking are innate traits that humans evolved to acquire as part of our brain's development. Literacy, on the other hand, is an invention. We are not born with a built-in apparatus for acquiring literacy, but instead require explicit instruction that presses other neural networks into service. This means that there is no critical period for acquiring literacy. People who don't get sufficient linguistic input during that developmental window for language never learn to speak or sign. But adults who have language can acquire literacy later in life. So you see that all four of the skills are unique, and while they each support the others, they carry with them different baggage from our early lives, and we can take a slightly different approach in our mastery of each. Let's begin with listening. I mentioned the critical period above, but in reality, there is no single critical period for every aspect of language. Babies learn to hear and distinguish sounds very early in life, and experiments reveal that the window for distinguishing certain sounds from one another is fairly narrow, a matter of a few months of exposure. How this works when you're an infant is that your brain is wide open to the input it receives. But, being the most marvelously efficient thing in the world, it will stop attending to distinctions that don't make a difference in order to reserve its resources for those that do. For example, if the language you're exposed to as an infant is tonal, you will, simply through that exposure, retain the innate capacity to attend to tone as meaningful. That means that if you learn a different tonal language after the brain lateralizes at around age 12, you will have an easier time of it even if the tones are wildly different than the ones you grew up hearing. If it is not tonal, then that feature shuts off pretty early in life. Does that mean that you could then never learn a tonal language? Well, obviously not. People do it every day. But it requires a different approach. You have to retrain your ear to those distinctions with explicit instruction. Fortunately, because people do this every day and always have, there are many, many resources in most languages to help you. Look up the feature you're struggling with on YouTube, find the good teachers, and be patient with yourself. Now for some more general advice. When listening, we're often told to listen for the key words, but aren't told what makes a word key. In practice, this means that ducklings often listen for any word they recognize, whether it's particularly crucial or not. So, what does make a word key? Meaning. As language flies down the conveyor belt towards your wonderful brain, you want to focus on the words most responsible for carrying the meaning you're trying to process. In practice, that means you want to listen for nouns and verbs. Once you've automatized processing that vocabulary, working memory becomes freed up to process the adjectives, adverbs, and eventually the detritus of things like prepositions, which are generally the last thing to be automatized. If you're listening to an audiobook or other recorded media, slowing it down can be helpful, up to a point. Paradoxically, if input is coming at you too slowly, your working memory can discard the beginning of a sentence or phrase before you've arrived at the end. Imagine trying to watch a film in super slow motion. So, try slowing things down by just 25% if you can. That also means the sound will be less distorted. Support your listening with text, the way we learned in the last video, as much as possible. And then Repeat, repeat, repeat at full speed. Try to eliminate background noise as much as you can, and if all else fails and you're not reading as you listen, try listening with your eyes closed. I always dance tango that way, and it helped me focus my attention on the music and my partner rather than using any working memory capacity on unnecessary visual processing. Put all the resources you can to what you need to attend to, and eventually it will become so automatic that you free up space for more. A listening exercise you can do at home is to listen to a brief passage of 5 to 7 sentences in the target language, and then pause it and try to write down the gist using those key meaning-bearing words. Then, listen to it a second time and try to fill in the rest word for word. You can also do this a third time. Over time, you can try longer and longer passages. And you can also practice this together with speaking by listening to a passage, then rephrasing it in the target language in your own words. Which brings us next to speaking. Speaking, the great prize we fear and covet above all others, is fraught business. Nothing in your language learning journey will make you feel so exposed as speaking, but take solace in the fact that this is pretty universal. But why is this so? Why can we feel fully confident in our abilities right up to the point where we open our mouths? Why can people learn a language to native-like proficiency and spend decades immersed in another culture, perhaps even writing a masterpiece in their second language, while still retaining a distinct accent? Our speech is deeply and intimately tied to our identities. It betrays us to one another in ways seemingly programmed to make us self-conscious. Accent, in particular, not the individual sounds of language, but the intonation, inflection, rhythm, the music of the way we speak, is so primal to us that without changing the shape of my vowels or consonants in the slightest, I can, by applying the recognizable hesitation and emphasis of one U.S. president, or the braggadocious iambic looping of another's pattern of speech, convey to you another person's essence. I can signal to you that I am American by asking if you've had dinner, or British by asking if you've had dinner. This witchcraft is called prosody or suprasegmental phonology, and I love it. It's the sound we apply above the syllabic level. It's the first thing we pick up as infants, and it's what our speech carries with us to our graves. Its signature marks us both as individuals and as members of a group. So it is understandably deeply tied to our feelings. Remember that affective barrier? These characteristics are the ways we mock others, the ways we expose ourselves to mockery. So, yeah, it's uncomfortable. Regarding accent, sounding native-like may or may not be a goal for you. My opera students must focus on diction as part of their career. For you, being intelligible but retaining the prosodic contours of your identity may be more reasonable and comfortable. I can't make that decision for you. But, in light of my demonstration earlier, keep in mind that attaining a native-like accent can be off-putting or even seen as duplicitous or mocking in a foreigner. It all depends. I don't want you to be afraid of trying to improve your accent. The reality is, because it's so deeply ingrained in us, that people like my dear voice majors generally have to work exceptionally hard to eliminate all traces of their native accent. So, you're not liable to overdo it unintentionally. Just keep these factors in mind as you set your goals and consider the social position you're placing yourself or being placed in relation to the culture you're engaging with. What you want to be able to do is, at minimum, approximate the pronunciation of the sound inventory of your target language. That is the segmental phonology of, for example, distinguishing an O or an O or an E and an E in Italian. Two things can help you here. First, explicit instruction. Go back to those YouTube videos, look up how to roll your R's or whatever, and try finding instruction from singers, accent or dialect coaches who work with actors, or even speech therapists to help you find targeted exercises to help you create these new shapes and sounds. But Overall, the implicit instruction of listening to a ton of input by native speakers is what helps it all soak in. Once again, be patient with yourself. But sounding the way you want is only one aspect, albeit a marvelously multifaceted one, of being understood. What are some communicative strategies we can use to convey the meat of meaning in conversation? In a language class, you will likely learn paired questions and answers pretty early on. My name is so and so. What's your name? I'm from a place. Where are you from? I'm fine. How are you today? Etc. Ducklings ask and answer these questions in class as their gateway to conversation. And my advice to them, and to you if you struggle with these, is to memorize your answers. Write them all down like so. My name is Austin. I'm fine today. I'm from Washington, D.C. I'm 42 years old, etc. This has a strategic value in that you can allow your partner to introduce the question if you're fuzzy on it, or be prepared if your teacher calls on you with the question. But there's more than just classroom utility in placing your focus here. Piano players often memorize a piece backwards, that is, memorizing the last section of a piece first, not literally note for note backwards, so that as they perform, they are continuously approaching territory they know better and better. In a foreign language, our brains have a tendency to seize the first thing off the conveyor belt and lose capacity for the rest. On a sentence level, this means you're liable to interpret the first noun you hear as the agent or subject of a sentence, regardless of its role. But in the back and forth of conversation, it often means we're weaker in our answers than our questions. You can combat this by deliberately focusing on the half your brain is more likely to gloss over. And in the case of these questions and answers, it also means you've learned to introduce and talk about yourself generally, which can come in handy. Next, circumlocate. As you become more sophisticated in your abilities, you'll want to remain in the target language when you converse as much as possible. This means you will inevitably reach a point where you don't know how to express something you want to say. The place on the map where here be dragons. Now, you don't want to stop and look it up because that breaks the flow of conversation. Remember Milonga mode. Also, ducklings, bless them, almost never actually learn the word that they look up in this context. They insert it into the conversation to stay in the target language like good little ducks, and then they toss it like disposable single-use plastic. In my opinion, it's honestly better to just toss in the word in your native language and keep it moving. But over time, you want to eliminate that as well. And outside of the classroom, you may well find yourself speaking to a person who doesn't know your native language. So, what do you do? An important skill to develop here is circumlocation. If you can't reach your point from where you're standing, you must take a different route. Don't remember the word for big? Try saying not small. Don't know a noun? Try describing how that thing is used. I'll give you a charming example. When I was in Florence, I had my heart set on acquiring a velvet evening bag to go to the opera. I did not know the word for velvet, but instead went into an antique shop and said in my best and most winning Italian, "Pardon me, sir, but might you carry an evening bag made of that fabric that feels like kittens? Forgive me, I don't know the word for it." He started to laugh and said, "Veluto," which sounded enough like velvet to me, so I shrugged and he urged me over to the sumptuous velvet chair and pointed to it. "Veluto? Veluto! So sorry, we don't have evening bags." So, since he'd given me a new word, I bought something else instead for his trouble, but I came home with velluto. You can cultivate this skill even outside of conversation. To work on speaking, you can try narrating your actions as you go about your day or describe things about you. For everything you can say, try to think of another way to express it. This will give you more confidence and flexibility. Bringing us next to reading. As I said earlier, the reading brain is not something we're born with, it's something we build. When we read, multiple systems are engaged simultaneously to decode text. Not only does reading engage with your capacity for visual processing, but also audio processing. In fact, dyslexia is not a reading disorder per se, but an audio processing disorder that reveals itself in the act of reading. Likewise, your sense of touch is activated when you read. If you read the word jump, your brain will send the faintest of signals to your legs, the unconscious echo of a jump. Is that not fascinating? And all this to construct a reading machine from parts your brain already had lying around. But it also means that our reading brains vary widely from one another. How you learn, whether on a page or a screen, from a phonetic or syllabic alphabet or pictograms, determines how your brain will cobble together your reading apparatus. This means that as adult learners, you can expect to have a very different experience from your peers. Adult foreign language reading is generally very uneven, and that's fine. There are two components to reading education as an adult. The first we can bypass if the target language happens to use the same writing system as the one we're already familiar with. But if it doesn't, we must learn the new system the way a child does. Fortunately, that again means we can turn to YouTube and the good teachers to show us. The second is pretty much identical to the first video I made, which covers the SQ3R system. Link in the description as it's not technically part of this language learning series. Just keep in mind that you want to do the last three steps, reading, reciting, and repeating, in the target language. And be sure to review the episode on input theory to learn how to prepare a text for reading practice. Finally, we come to writing. Writing is an art, even in our native languages, and learning to express ourselves well in writing is something we're always learning and improving. This will, of course, go double for writing in a foreign language. So here's my advice. Don't translate. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. Just compose, revise, and edit in the target language. Just, she says. Translation is its own art and craft separate from mastery in a language or skill in writing. Translation must arise from a strong foundation lest the entire structure crumble. So avoid the temptation to compose something in your native language and translate it into the target language. Instead, do it from scratch and do it systematically as you move from outline to revision. Find a process and use it. All writers are a little different, and there's lots of good advice on the writing process out there, so find one you like and do it in the target language. Next, get a good dictionary. Find a good dictionary in the target language and use it when you write. As a duckling, you'll already have a native language to target language dictionary, or ought to, but when you write, a target language only dictionary is a great tool to have. Try learning pragmatics as well. Pragmatics are fascinating. Pragmatics are the rules of the road in expressing ourselves. They govern things like turn taking in conversation or how we organize an essay. For example, in American English, we tend to favor the classic tell 'em what you'll tell 'em, and then tell 'em what you told 'em, intro, body, and conclusion format. But in Arabic, for example, more emphasis is placed in citation, and they tend to employ more poetic restatement in their prose, well, and their poetry for that matter. Learning about pragmatics will help you better organize the way you communicate, and it's just really fascinating stuff. Finally, a great exercise for writing is to compose poetry in the target language. I favor Petrarchan's sonnets in Italian because I like them, but also because their strict form gives me just the right kind of structure to work with in order to flex my writing muscles. And of course, it's a great way to appreciate more about the culture you're engaging with through language learning. Well, my ducklings, I know this was a long one, so I've included time skips so you can go to whichever skill you're working on at the moment. But hopefully this video has shown you a little bit about the different ways our brains handle the skills of language and provided you with some help in doing so. Not too many references for you today, and one of them is a repeat. In all honesty, I cannot find all of the papers and everything from grad school. So these are just things that I've put into my own practice that I learned about because I was so lucky to have such good teachers myself. And I'm afraid I can't really provide better citations, but I can vouch for these methods. Thanks as always to the wonderful people who made these beautiful PowerPoint slides. Find me on Discord if you need any help or have any questions, and I will see you in class.